Hey, what's going on YouTube? Welcome to my brand new series I'm calling League Academy, where I'll be covering everything from the very basics of League of Legends to the more advanced things as we get through the series. So in this first video, I'm going to be talking about the meta in League of Legends, as well as how to play each role and lane. So with that said, let's get right into it. So first, let's talk about what it means when somebody mentions the meta. So the meta is pretty much the layout that's chosen by the players. It's the most common layout used because generally it's going to be the most effective one at winning your team the game. Generally, the meta is passed down by pro teams because it's what they find best in order to win those tournaments and get the prize money. Then of course, other players kind of adapt the strategies that they've seen in pro games, and it kind of forms the League of Legends meta. So as a lot of you probably know right now, this is the current meta. You'll first have the top lane solo, and they'll usually be playing either a tank or a fighter. Now keep in mind, people like to adapt their own strategies, and this isn't always 100% accurate. You will see some AD carries top lane and whatnot, but generally this is what will happen. Then of course you'll also have a solo mid lane, and they'll usually be a mage or assassin. Then there's going to be your jungler, who will usually be on either an assassin, tank, or fighter. Then it gets a little different because your bottom lane is almost always a duo, and you'll have your marksman, which is always called the AD carry, and then you'll have a support champion with them, which will either be a controller, mage, or a tank. Now, although this is how the current meta is played, it is worth noting that sometimes some players will choose things that are very unique. Two players may queue together and play two strong champions with crowd control in the bottom lane and just focus on trying to kill the enemy bot lane rather than farming up for items and playing more traditionally. This is what a lot of people will call a kill lane. As I previously mentioned, there is some really strong solo AD carries, so you may see one of those in the top lane as well to destroy a tanky top laner instead of playing something more traditional. Right now, however, the meta is having two people in the bottom lane working together, one in the top, one in mid, and a jungler that roams around trying to help his lanes. Now I'm going to be talking about each role and what their job is in League of Legends. I'll also cover each lane at the same time. So let's start off with that duo lane, which is the bottom lane. This lane's going to consist of the support champion and a marksman, which people call the AD carry. The AD carry is generally the weakest early game champion on your team, so you have the support champion there to help them secure any farm they need so they can carry the game in the late game. This lane also happens to be the closest one to the dragon, which is usually highly contested, and it's great to have two champions already nearby so they can go to a dragon to contest it if the enemy is trying to take it. Alright, so the first role we're going to cover in the bottom lane is the support. This is usually going to be either a controller, mage, or a tank. An example of a controller would of course be something like Janna, a mage would be something like Brand, and a tank like seen in this gameplay here would be a Shen. A support champion is generally somebody who makes your team stronger either by giving them buffs or by having strong team fighting abilities. During that lane phase, your main goal will be to protect your AD carry at all costs. They are champions who really rely on getting a lot of farm to get their items, so they'll be able to do a lot of damage in that mid and late game. In a situation where your AD carry would end up dying, you'll usually want to sacrifice yourself if it is possible, if you can get your AD carry out alive. Them being alive of course means they'll be able to grab more farm and therefore get their items just a little bit quicker. If however you're a really fed champion and your AD carry seems pretty subpar, then you're probably not going to want to do this. The next thing you'll have to do as a support champion is set up kills for your team. A lot of the support champions out there have some really strong crowd control abilities, so if you are one of those supports, try to get your AD carry some kills in the lane phase or roam around the map and do the same for your teammates. Now next of course there is warding, and this is a huge part of being a support champion. You'll need to get a sightstone early on in the lane phase so you'll be able to keep the river warded as much as possible. This will give you some much needed vision in the area so you'll be able to see the enemy jungler or mid laner coming in for a gank. There are also a lot of pokey support champions as well, and they will usually sit in a lane brush throwing out skill shots, so you may want to also ward those brushes well to see those so they're much easier to dodge. It's also a really good idea when you are grouped up with your team to ward brush behind you so you can watch for enemy assassins coming in for ganks. Now since you are a support champion, you should also be trying to let your carries get the kills. They'll generally do a lot more damage than you in the late game. Now of course this depends a lot on your support pick, so you need to let them get those kills. A lot of people kind of complain about having to play support, but a lot of people don't realize how much exactly supports can influence a game. Alright, now let's look at the other half of the bot lane, the marksman, aka the AD carry. So these are ranged champions that are attack damage based. Most of these champions are also very auto attack based and go for a high damage build that usually have lifesteal, attack speed, and critical strike chance. Of course, depending on the AD carry you're playing, this may not always be the case. If you're somebody that likes to be ranged, do a lot of damage, and mostly just be auto-attacking, then this will probably be the role for you. Now marksmen, however, are very reliant on farm. They have a very expensive build and need a lot of items to be able to get through tanks and bruisers' health pools so they can carry the game. These are champions that don't get strong naturally in most cases because they are so auto-attack reliant, so they really need their items. Now positioning properly is also going to be extremely important because you are a very squishy champion. As I said, you go for a very high damage build, you're going to have very little defensives. Most of these champions are pretty strong against fighters and tanks because you can exploit their low mobility and stay at range while you kill them. Of course, this won't always be true. If something like a Jax is really fed, he will be able to two-shot you, but in a normal game, usually you'll be pretty strong against those fighters and tanks. Most marksmen, however, struggle against assassins and mages since you are so squishy. If an assassin gets on top of you, you will die very quickly, and a mage can use their superior range to kill you, or if they do land a crowd control, you're going to die that way instead. Now let's move on to the second lane, the top lane, which is sometimes referred to as the island. This is a lane that generally consists of tanks and fighters with a few ranged champions thrown in as well. It's the longest solo lane in League of Legends, so you'll need to be a champion with either some decent mobility or a tanky champion, so if you do get ganked, you do have a chance of escaping. The reason this lane is sometimes called the island is because it's usually the least ganked lane and is mostly just a 1v1. Therefore, champion matchups are extremely important to know because this lane generally you're not going to get a lot of attention from your jungler. There of course are some exceptions like shutting down a Nasus's farm, but usually you'll be on your own. Top laners also generally take teleport in this meta, so you'll need to be looking at your minimap for ganking opportunities. It's also going to help if you have knowledge of how to split push properly so you can join teamfights or objectives whenever you want with that teleport while you push a lane. So the first type of champion you'll find in that top lane usually would be a tank. It just so happens I'm playing one at the moment, Singed. These are very durable champions that can take a lot of damage from the enemy team and are usually used to soak damage to keep their carries safe who are positioned behind them. Most tanks will also have forms of crowd control so they can set up kills for their team. You'll want to use these strong crowd control abilities to engage into the enemy team. Wait until you know that your team is ready to follow up on your engage and then grab a target for them to delete. Tanks also make really strong peelers. Since you'll have crowd control in most cases and you're very tanky, try to get high damage champions from the enemy team off of your squishier champions so they can kite away and deal their damage safely. This is what the term peeling means in League of Legends, taking somebody off one of your allies. Now tanks, however, have some very limited damage. Most of them will take a very long time to kill targets, so you're usually reliant on having teammates follow up with you. Tanks are usually very strong against assassins and mages because they struggle at taking down tanks since tanks take very little damage from them. Tanks will then be able to use their crowd control abilities to stick on top of these targets and eventually bring them down. Now tanks, however, are very weak against fighters and marksmen. Fighters have some pretty decent tankiness and damage, so they'll be able to take very little damage from tanks and do some pretty good damage their own. Marksmen will then just be able to kite tanks using their range and eventually bring them down before the tank can even get on top of them. The other really common top laner would be the fighter, aka the bruiser. Here for an example, I'm showing Garen. These are often short range champions, usually melee, so they rely on getting on top of their targets and staying there. They have some decent tankiness and usually built-in tanky abilities, but are far from being true tanks. They are, however, much tankier than assassins, marksmen, mages, and supports. Now fighters also have some pretty decent damage. A lot of them also have some really strong abilities as well, so they usually only build 1 or 2 damage items and then go full tank afterwards. This will of course allow them to do a pretty high amount of damage and still be very tanky. Since fighters are usually melee though, they can sometimes struggle against ranged champions, especially in the early game. Screw you, Teemo. Most fighters will have a gap closer, but a lot of the champions they'll be against have a built-in escape, or they may have flash available, so if you do get on top of them and you use one of them, you're back to where you started, except now your gap closer is on cooldown. This is pretty much why it's easy to kite a lot of the bruisers out there. A lot of fighters are strong against assassins and tanks because they can use their tankiness to survive the burst damage from assassins, and they do have pretty decent damage to take down the assassins as well, and eventually get through tanks. The next lane we're going to look at is mid lane, and this is what I call Action Valley. In the mid lane, you're usually going to see mages and assassins. The mid lane is actually the shortest lane in League of Legends, and therefore usually the most fast-paced one as well. The turrets in this lane are also the shortest distance from each other in this lane, so it's usually easier to retreat to your tower, although there is more gank paths that the enemy jungler can use, so make sure that you're warding. It's very, very important. Good map awareness and map control are two crucial skills to have as a mid laner because most mid laners should spend a decent amount of time roaming and helping their lanes. They are in the middle after all. Since of course you are in the middle of the map, you can make it to top lane and bottom lane rather quickly to help them out. So the first type of champion you're going to see in the mid lane is assassins. They're champions that are very squishy and usually need to be very patient and need to pick their timing properly to engage into the enemy. You'll usually want to wait for defensives or crowd controls to be down from the enemy team before you sweep in from behind and quickly dispose of a target. These assassins have very high burst damage, so you can delete a target really quickly. You won't necessarily have good sustain damage, which would be damage over time, but when you combo your abilities together, you do a very high amount of damage in a very short time. Most of this damage, however, is single target damage. This means they're generally not the best team fighters out there because they don't do any AoE damage, they are just single target based. Most of these assassins also have some really high mobility. You want to use this to roam around the map as much as you can and take out vulnerable targets. This means you're going to need that good map awareness I mentioned before to find those low health targets that you can delete and get yourself snowballing. The assassin playstyle is very high risk and high reward. You can delete targets really quickly, but if you get caught out, you'll die just as fast. Generally, you're going to be strong against those squishy targets and should be able to burst them down instantly, but against those tankier ones, however, that don't really take too much damage from you, you're usually going to get destroyed. Another really common champion in the mid lane would be mages. These are often long-range champions and in some cases have even longer range than marksmen. A lot of the mages out there will have some amount of AoE damage, so they make really strong team fighters. For anybody that doesn't know, AoE damage is anything that is in an area of effect which does damage to multiple targets. Of course, in a team fight, since a lot of targets are usually clumped up, this is what makes mages pretty strong. Sometimes you can even lose the lane phase, but when you get into the late game team fights, you do so much AoE damage that it becomes really hard to deal with you. Now, mages will usually be able to combo their abilities to do some really high burst damage as well. It's usually less than assassin's burst damage, but it's still usually high enough to delete squishy targets like marksmen. Then next, most mages also have some fairly strong crowd controls. This is what makes mid lane one of the highest gank lanes because if you can land your crowd control when the jungler comes in for a gank, it's usually a pretty free kill. Now the one downside is that most mages are skill shot reliant. That means your abilities are dodgeable, so you can struggle against some champions like assassins who can quickly dodge your abilities and then delete you while they're on cooldown. Now you're also usually pretty weak against tanks when you are fighting them because you don't do much damage to them and usually they can out-sustain your damage and kill you at the same time. The good thing, however, is that in most scenarios, you will be the best team fighter. And last, we've got the role for people that don't actually like to lane. We have the jungle. In the jungle, you usually be playing one of the three previous types of champions, the assassins, fighters, or a tank. For a champion to be a successful jungler, it's going to need to be able to clear through the jungle camps and have some way of ganking lanes effectively. Champions with either some solid AoE abilities to clear through the camps, with strong sustain, or with really solid ganks are usually going to be the ones you find in the jungle. This is probably the hardest role to do properly because you'll need extensive knowledge of the game, like how each champion in the game works, how to properly ward to help out your team, which lane you feel like needs most help, and you'll also need to know how to deal with the enemy jungler that you're against. So now I'm going to cover why each champion I mentioned previously works in the jungle. Now assassins are going to be great because they can use their high mobility and damage to gank lanes really quickly and delete targets. Most assassins, however, don't have amazing jungle clear, so you are limited to how quick you can clear those, but your ganks are incredibly strong. Fighters then usually have some tankiness and damage to clear through the jungle fine. Since you usually have a gap closer and most also have crowd control, you have some really solid ganks as well. Jump onto your target, crowd control them, and have your team follow up with your damage. Then of course you have the tanks. They're really strong as well because they have some really solid crowd controls. In most cases, your jungle clear is going to be pretty slow because you do have limited damage, but you can spend more time ganking lanes and get your team snowballing with the crowd control you provide. Like I said, you don't have too much damage, but as long as your team follows up on all of your crowd control, you can get some really easy kills. So that covers everything for episode 1, which was the meta, roles, and lanes. I know for some of you this video was probably basic, but this is the very first episode of League Academy, and it is supposed to be basic. We're going to build on from here. In the next episode, I'm going to cover 10 champions that I feel like are really easy for beginners, and they were pretty cheap as well, so you can get right into League of Legends. But other than that, I'd just like to thank you guys for watching the video. I really do appreciate it, and if you do have any friends that are new into League of Legends and are trying to learn how to exactly play the game, then make sure you pass this video along. But anyways, thank you guys a ton again, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Take it easy, have a good day, and peace.